I'm very amazed at how many people have come, but it is a fascinating subject. I'd like to introduce John, who has been coming in the library to research projects in depth. And he works with Steve Rice and me in the history room, and he goes really to the last end to try to get tax records and things out of the archives. So his research is really, really amazing. Yeah. And he writes for the Lake Forest Park Association newsletter. And this last one he wrote was about the Cranberry Marsh, Casgrain's Cranberry Marsh, and Casgrain was the engineer for the canal. And I said, would you do something for Door County History Day? So I'm really lucky to have him here today to talk about this. And I'd like to point out at the back, I have some questionnaires. Heritage Alliance of Door County would like to get some feedback. So if you could take a minute to fill those out, that would be very much appreciated. John?
Thank you, Laura. Thank you all for coming today. Perhaps we could lock the door. Much of the history that we read in books and observe in museums is known history, familiar history, and you might even say accepted history, but it is far from static. History evolves. History changes. The events may stay the same, but our interpretation of the events can change and do. For example, you can view a set of historical events many years later, but from a new perspective, and see a pattern emerge that you hadn't considered before. And you say to yourself, oh, now I understand differently. Or you can dig into the facts as an alternative and dig deeper into the written record and delve into the memories and reflections of people who witnessed events. And in the process, you can uncover new stories, hidden stories. And that's what I'd like to accomplish this afternoon. Then it's a slide. There. My topic today is the hidden story of two individuals, very different individuals, who are from late 1800s Sturgeon Bay, who were both deeply invested in a cranberry marsh in the eastern part of the township. One financially invested, the other invested personally, physically. And the talk is also about an old road through the woods that led me to Peter Johnson, William Casgrain, and the Cranberry Marsh. I'd like to start with a map. This is Sturgeon Bay Township at the turn of the century, 1899. And just to orient you, this is the downtown area on both sides of the bay, the canal area, Lake Shore. And the map also shows the principal roads that were in use at the turn of the century. Keep in mind, this is before automobiles. And since it's a tax plat map, it also shows the names of the owners of the larger parcels in the township. Now, today we're going to concentrate on this geographical area right in here, in the eastern part of the township. Note the names of the owners. P. Johnson, that's Peter Johnson. That's his 40-acre plot. And this little dot in the corner represents that this particular plot had a structure there, a place to live. Moving to the northeast, W.T. Casgrain and William Casgrain. This larger plot up here is the Sturgeon Bay Company, and but that actually is William Casgrain. And this 50-plus acre lot up here, William Casgrain as well. Now, this was a fairly remote area at the turn of the century, and for all intents and purposes, it still is today. It consists of forested covered sand ridges, lowlands and swampland. But in this part of section 12 right here, showing a good part of the section, is our open area that contains a fen, a spring-fed fen that is clear of trees and is quite open. Now, this area was virtually unpopulated at the turn of the century. The closest settlements were down here at the canal station, where there was a little village that grew up around the life-saving station there and the lighthouses. There was a small little shanty village here that I wasn't aware of until recently called Centerville. And it was located at the midpoint on the canal path. It had a warehouse and a small dock in the early days of the canal. And then there was also the Evergreen neighborhood here. This was anchored by the Evergreen Nursery, which was established in 1868. And the neighboring farms here made up the Evergreen neighborhood. This here is the Evergreen Road. It's now known as TT or Michigan Avenue. But back then, it dead ended at the Evergreen Nursery, which contributed to the remoteness of our subject area here. Now that changed in the mid-20s when a Milwaukee developer named William Casgrain came to Door County and began to acquire lakefront properties from about right here all the way down to about, right here. And with the purpose of creating a vacation home development called Lake Forest Park. Now, to accommodate that development, the town extended the Evergreen Road all the way out to the lake shore to accommodate the building of the development here and also some development to the north of it. This is the original 1927 survey plat for that Lake Forest Park Vacation Home subdivision. It's just a section of it from about right here down to this road here. Now, there are 3 roads on this survey plat, only 3 roads. One is Lake Forest Park Road, which went the length of the subdivision along the properties there and stopped at this road here, which was Buffalo Ridge Trail. And coming off Buffalo Ridge Trail was a small road too that ran in a northeasterly direction through the woods and just ran for about a mile and stopped. Now, to give you a sense of scale, the lot sizes here are 100-foot lots, and these squares are each 40-acre outlots. And all 3 of these roads in 1927 were just dirt roads. And what's unique about this road here is, whereas Lake Forest Park and Buffalo Ridge Trail are paved roads today, this road is gone. There's no sign of it. You can drive down Buffalo Ridge Road and look along the road here for any indication that there was a road there, and there is none. And this kind of piqued my curiosity. So what I did is I called my neighbor who owned these 2 outlots here, this one and this one, and asked his permission to walk on his property, which he granted. He encouraged me not to walk during deer season. So I, using this map, which is a very accurately drawn map because it is made by a surveyor, I went to this point here where there was a surveyor's marker indicating the corner of this section. And using GPS technology, I followed on a northerly bearing along the section line here and got to the point where the old road, the lost road as I call it, should have crossed the section line. And this is what I found. Now, it could be a road. I mean, it was kind of clear. It was on the top of the dune, going along the ridge. There was a creek bed over here, so it was a logical place for a road. But as I walked up and down the ridge, I noticed there were varying differences of vegetation. There weren't no really big 100-year-old trees that would indicate that it wasn't a road, but still, there were other ridges in the area that looked just like it. So there was really nothing definitive there that said to me, man-made road. Now, the surveyor chose to include this road in his survey, but no other roads in Lake Forest Park. And the reason for this may be that there are other logging roads through the woods, I'm aware of that, but this was the only one he put on the survey. And the reason for that may be because it did traverse actual outlets that belong to Lake Forest Park. This little piece here fell outside of Lake Forest Park. So he may have included it and then stopped it where it was no longer a factor with Lake Forest Park, but that's just speculation. Also, for future reference, to locate where the road is, sometimes it's helpful to use a geological reference like Chippewa Drive here, and take a straight line from Chippewa Drive to where it would touch the road. And it's at this point that the road makes a distinct turn almost due north. And this was important for comparing to other future maps and to other photographs and whatnot. So, now, the fact that road didn't exist, it's not visible today, raised three questions in my mind. One, what was the original purpose of the road? Two, where did the road ultimately go? And three, why did it disappear? To address these questions, we need to set our way back machine to 1871 Sturgeon Bay. Now, I'm cheating a little here because this is a map from June of 1872, but it is such a good map, I want to use it to describe the events that occurred in 1871 and before. Now, what was going on in Sturgeon Bay in 1871? Well, the big issue of the day was the prospective canal that was going to go in somewhere along this little isthmus here, and connecting Sturgeon Bay to Lake Michigan, thereby saving 75 miles of navigation around the tip of the peninsula, 150 miles round trip. And it also avoided the dangerous navigation of the Death's Door Strait up at the top. So it was a highly important canal. And the main proponent behind the canal was a gentleman named Joseph Terracini. Now, he was a state senator from Sturgeon Bay, and he was also he was publisher of the Door County Advocate, which was the first newspaper on the peninsula. And he devoted 10 years of his life to making this canal become a reality. He talked to anyone he could about the benefits and the virtues of this canal, extolling it to politicians, business people, emphasizing that it would not only benefit Sturgeon Bay, but it would benefit the entire Northeast Wisconsin region. Now, in 1864, in the state legislature, he was able to get approved an authorization to create a corporation to build the canal. But he still needed funding. So he went to Washington. And in 1865 and 1866, he lobbied to get an appropriation to fund the canal. He was not successful at first, but finally prevailed. An appropriation came through from the U.S. Congress in the form of 200,000 acres of timberland that could be sold in proportion with the completion of the canal. What that meant was, after the canal was 1/4 complete, then 1/4 of the timberlands were released for sale. Now, it's not timberland in the vicinity of the canal. it was timberland from up in northern Wisconsin. And so the problem with that approach is the canal is basically being funded in arrears. You have to complete it, then you get the money. So they needed some upfront money to get the thing kicked off, to get it rolling. Now, Joseph Harris, out of his own pocket, funded a survey, a rudimentary survey in 1867 that laid out the canal along this route here, which was along the old Portage Road from the bay out to what was called Portage Bay out here. And they cut a 100-foot swath of timber through the woods. They got a straight line along it. And the engineer Thompson, he did calculations based on the elevation along that proposed canal line to determine how much earth would actually have to be removed to create the canal. And so based on those calculations and an estimate of what it would cost to dredge the approach to the canal and the exit from the canal in the bay, they came up with an estimate of $700,000. Now, that was probably more than the timberland was worth. So Harris went back to Congress, lobbied for more of an appropriation. He didn't get more land, but what he did get was a commitment from the federal government to foot the bill for what was called the Harbor of Refuge. This is where it actually went in down here, and you're probably familiar with those breakwaters at the end of the canal. That's the Harbor of Refuge. And the government also agreed to be responsible for dredging out the channel here within the bay. That helped lower the cost of the canal and got it closer to what the appropriation was. Secondly, he received an appropriation late in 1870, a cash appropriation, to perform a government survey. Not just having a local engineer do it, but having representatives of the U.S. Engineering Corps come in and do the survey. And that's where William T. Casgrain enters the story. Casgrain was a young 34-year-old French-Canadian engineer with the U.S. Engineering Corps. Although he was a lowly lieutenant, he had made a name for himself designing and constructing harbors, breakwater, bridges, and canals throughout the Great Lakes region. He also co-authored a book on surveying, which became an industry standard. So when he arrived with his team in June of 1871, he had three objectives. One was to survey the canal route. Two was to determine the feasibility of the canal. And three was to provide a reasonable estimate of its cost. So they got to work, as I said, in June, and they started at this end on the bay side, and they followed that path that had been established in 1867 for the canal. It was already still clear cut, so they could begin to do their work. And what they did was a boring process. Not that it was dull, it was just a boring process. They would bore into the earth down to a depth that would be below the level of the canal, where the bottom of the canal would be. And that was at 13 feet below the lake level. So when they started here, they only had to go down about 20, 25 feet to get to that point. And the reason they're doing this is they wanted to determine that the substratum that they were boring into was the kind that could be removed by a dredge. So this went toward the feasibility. They didn't want to run into any solid limestone or anything that would say, no, it's going to be too expensive to build this canal. So to do that boring on this path, and what they did is they did it in 500-foot intervals. They had a long rod and an auger that had been made in Chicago. And then up here, they built a basically like an oil derrick out of pine boards, really thick pine boards, and then threaded the rod down. And then manually, they had a bar that the men, sometimes 4, 5, 6 men, would turn the bar, and they would just auger down and drill. And that went pretty well. They were up until they got up here to the highest point on the path, which was up here by it's called the Buffalo Ridge. And at this point, they couldn't get down to the required depth. They could only get down about 15, 20 feet. It wasn't because of the substratum. It was because the rod and the auger wasn't working effectively. So they did the best they could going towards the shore, and were able to get to the required depths. And then when they got to the shore, they went out 900 feet out on the bay. They waited for a calm day, and they set the derrick up out there in 15 feet of water and went down another 15 feet just to confirm that there wasn't some kind of limestone shelf out there that would prevent the harbor being dredged for the approach to the canal. And that all worked out fine. Good feedback. Now, while the boring crew was doing their work along this line, Casgrain was exploring this area in here for other possible canal routes. And he had decided that he found an alternative to the original route that he liked. And the principal advantage of this route here was that it provided a straight line of sight for when a ship entered the canal to where it exited the canal. And this meant that there were no turns required coming through the canal. Along the original route, that route required 2 turns. And because this was straight and didn't have an angle in it, it was actually 250 feet shorter than the original 1867 route. And by doing a similar survey, they had cut a swath of the crew had cut a swath through the woods so that they could do the survey. He determined by elevations that on average, the new route to about 3/4 of the south was on average about 2 feet lower than the original route. And that combination of shorter and lower measurably reduced the amount of dredging or the digging that had to be done to build the canal. And he was estimating that it would save approximately 100,000 of the 700,000 original cost estimate. So they went ahead and did the same boring process along this route, and with a new auger and rod that had been fixed by a local welder here in Sturgeon Bay, they were able to move much quicker. And they started in early August and were finished by September. And again, they did not run into any substratum that would prevent them from building the canal. Now, when they finished, the officers of the Canal Corporation came out to view the site. And this was in early September, and they were thrilled that not only that they found a better, actually safer approach, but that it was much less expensive and it was feasible. And so they were all gung-ho and ready to go, start building the canal. All that was required was to finish the report, formal report. And so they took all the core samples and field notes and sent it all back to Chicago. Casgrain had to make another trip, I think, to the Green Bay area, another project, but then he's going to Chicago to do the report, and all would be fine. But do you recall what happened in Chicago in October of 1871? I think you do. It's on the timeline over here, the Chicago fire. Destroyed everything. All the samples, all the field notes, it's all gone. Actually, there's also, at the same time, there was a fire up here that devastated southern Door County, causing great loss of life and property as well. So things look bleak, but Casgrain adapted. He had two things going for him. One, the gentleman who was in charge of the boring process was a relative of his. He had the same last name as his mother's maiden name. I'm not sure if he was a cousin, but he was definitely related. Well, his name was William Beatty. And while he was doing the borings, he kept a personal journal of how far they were going down and what they were running into. And he did it for every single boring point on the site. And that journal was not sent to Chicago. That was saved. Also, he had, Casgrain had access to this 1967 survey done by Thompson. And the benefit of that was he had an accurate readings of what the topography here and what the height was. And he knew from his memory that he was 2 feet shorter here. And so based on these actual calculations here that were saved, still had them from 67, he was able to make a reasonable estimate of the costs. So he completed the report. It wasn't the prettiest report. The map looked like this. He did have the canal route in there, but he had the elevations of the old quarry road. But it was still sufficient to get the job done. And the canal company was thrilled. And because of this, Casgrain was held very highly in their view. Was actually kind of a hero. He had delivered a report affirming the feasibility of the project and located a superior and less expensive route for the canal. The canal company offered him the job of chief engineer for the project to superintend the day-to-day construction. An offer he promptly accepted and resigned his commission with the Corps. The reason I went into so much detail about Casgrain's role on the canal was because this is what he was known for. This, as the architect and engineer of this critical, innovative, and ultimately successful canal project, this became what was, in a sense, his known history. What was not known about Casgrain is what came next. When he returned to Sturgeon Bay in the spring of 1872, forgive me if I say 1972, that's why we have the timeline. He was ready to get to work on the canal, which the construction started in July of that year. But he came early, and he had time now to prepare this, what I would call a very pristine, beautiful map with lots of details, with the correct elevations on the actual canal route, and lots of detail about the surrounding area here. When he came, Joseph Harris welcomed him. He sold him some land, but Casgrain decided to take up quarters in the Advocate building on the second floor of the newspaper. And what he did is he created an office there for the canal company, and he also used it as a sleeping quarters. He did not have his young family come to Sturgeon Bay. After all, the project was only going to take 2-3 years. No need to uproot them and bring them to Sturgeon Bay. So he left his young 4 children and his wife at home. What's interesting on this map is he went into a lot of detail about an area up here in the eastern part of the township that had absolutely nothing to do with the canal. And you can see that he did this map in June of 1872, and he's already calling this a Cranberry meadow. And there's ditches here that are already dug. And what that tells me is he didn't start the meadow himself, but that someone else was already there. And that makes sense because in 1867, Wisconsin passed legislation very friendly to cranberry farming, being able to drain land and whatnot. And by 1872, Wisconsin had more land under cranberry cultivation than any state in the country, including Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Maine, which had been cranberry areas in the east. The Berlin area alone, downstate, generated 35,000 barrels of cranberries in 1872, which was the equivalent of more than $500,000 of product. So I think Casgrain was kind of aware of this. He became captivated with the idea of possibly cultivating cranberries, and he began to acquire land that very first year while he was working on the canal. He acquired land in that area. And all of the land he acquired is outlined in the green, and the dates represent when he acquired the land. The 1872 acquisitions, which is basically the entire marsh, and these lots here adjacent to it, were acquired through applying for patents with the state of Wisconsin through the 1850 Swamplands Act. And what that meant was he was able to basically get this land at a nominal cost, but he had an obligation to do something to make it, quote, productive. Because back then, swampland was swampland. There was nothing. So he acquired this land. The following year, he did purchase another 40-acre plot from an individual, William Scott, who lived in the area too, to complete his purchases. This land up here he acquired later through delinquent taxes. But when he returned to Sturgeon Bay in 1873 to begin work on the canal, he actually came in the middle of winter. He came at the end of February to record all of these purchases and to sell a 1/2 interest in all the land he had acquired the year before to Milwaukee investors, and created what was called the Sturgeon Bay Company. And out of that sale of the interest, they were able to raise $10,000 that were then used to make improvements in the marsh. Now, since he was working full-time on the canal, he had to hire folks to work out at the marsh. So he hired a crew to basically clear 70 acres in the vicinity of the fen, and to plant new vines in the fen, to deepen these ditches that provided some control over the level of water in the fen, and to incorporate a process called sanding, which was done in cranberry marshes, where you would take sand and fill in under the vines, effectively filling in the fen. And the purpose of that was to reduce the humidity and provide better aeration for the cranberry plant. So all this was done in that first summer, and to move all that sand from a dune here down to the cranberry. Where the cranberry operation was, they actually built a little wooden railroad with cars that could move the sand to make it more efficient. Now, the person in charge of this was a gentleman called Uncle Dan Rice, and he was a Door County pioneer, and actually he was a retired county judge, and was related to Joseph Harris by marriage. Harris's son married Uncle Dan's daughter. So I was getting a sense that a lot of people who knew people kind of formed your groups of, and so, Casgrain was choosing people that Harris knew to run this. So basically, After that first year, they were anticipating at least some harvest, but there was a frost and the berries all froze, and there was literally no harvest the first year. The second year in 1874, Uncle Dan was still in charge, and they had a modest harvest. But during 1874, basically the money ran out, and Casgrain consolidated, and he put the pass the baton and the Marsh to an individual named Peter Johnson, who was a Norwegian immigrant, hence the Scandinavian spelling of his name. And Peter probably worked on the crew in 1873 and 1872 and 1873 and 1874, and won the confidence of Casgrain to take care of the Marsh. Now, also in 1874, there was a pause in the construction of the canal due to economic conditions, and that pause lasted a full 3 years, till 1877. So Casgrain, during that period, was away on other projects, leaving Peter in charge of the Marsh. Now, Peter was pretty much working on this on his own, but when harvest time came along, he needed help. So he advertised in the local paper. Now, what's interesting, I think, about this ad is, well, he's looking for boys and girls, obviously to lower his cost of the harvest. He's also offering board. I mean, he pays them for their bushels, but then would charge them 40 cents a day to stay there. So if they pick 3 bushels, would earn $1.80 less $40 for the day. But the fact that it's board means there must be facilities out there. There had to be a place for the kids to stay, in a barn or whatever. And he also gave them the option, if they wanted to, they could bring their own cook stove and bedding room. So in essence, he was envisioning that there would be, basically kind of camping out by the fen. Also, it says here that the fen is 2 miles north of the canal. And this implied to me that the canal was approached from the south. So if you have, and that where it played more into the Lost Road. Also, when all that activity was going on in 1873 and 74, there needed to be a way to access the canal. And so I think it was accessed from this direction along this Lost Road. Now, in 1874, Peter Johnson also acquired this 40 acres here through a tax lien auction where there were delinquent taxes. And so he paid the taxes each year thereafter, and finally got title for the property in 1881. But in 74, he moved out to the fen and built a shanty here and lived there during the growing season. In 1879, with the canal excavation complete, Casgrain left Sturgeon Bay to become Commissioner of Public Works in Milwaukee, and he appointed Peter to serve as his agent and factotum on all his Door County interests, expanding Peter's responsibilities. In 1881, Casgrain received an offer of $5,000 for all of his fen properties. This was an offer he considered. The $5,000 was certainly more than he had paid for the property, but it was less than what he had invested in it. And he ultimately declined the offer. Now, he did sell some of the land that was not essential to the operating of the Cranberry Marsh. He sold this land up here in 1881. Actually, it was 160 acres. He started up here for $220. And then he sold this 40 acres to a friend in town for $200, but kept the cranberry operation intact. Now, cranberry harvests over the years were hit and miss, and they were mostly miss. And there were three reasons for this: frost, fire, and the inability to manage the water level. There were early frosts in 1873, 1875, 79, 1883, 1886, 1888, 1890. Get the picture here. And when there was a frost, it basically froze the berries on the vine, and they weren't good for harvesting. In 1883, in September, the Advocate reported probably the greatest loss suffered by any individual from this cause is Captain Casgrain, whose entire crop of cranberries were destroyed by the cold on Saturday night, although every effort was made by Peter Johnson, the man in charge, to prevent it. Fires were built all over the marsh and kept burning all night. But about 3 a.m., a cold wave descended, which caused the smoke that hung over the marsh like a pall to ascend, and the mercury in the thermometer fell to 30 degrees. Stagnant water was skimmed over with ice in nearly all places, and the ground was white with frost in many parts. The loss to Mr. Casgrain will be not far from $500, as the crop, which was promised to be an abundant one this year, was just about ready to be picked. Likewise, in 1889 and in 1993, fires burned over the fen and burned the cranberry vines. So there were no harvests in those years. When the vines were burned, though, they could recover in the following year. They just had to be, you had to weed out the grass and other plants that had grown in that were competing with the vines. So it still required a fair amount of work. Now, the problem of managing the water level was a more insidious one. They were able to lower the marsh by the use of these ditches. And there was a sluice that would allow water to come out. But the problem was they couldn't raise the level of the marsh when they wanted to, because it's a spring-fed marsh from below the ground. There were no creeks coming into the marsh at all. And so the inability to raise the level perhaps affected their ability if there was a fire, or perhaps raising the water level may even help in situations of frost. But they were not able to control the water level. Now, they did have discussions as early as 1874 to build a ditch up to a creek that was in the north here and bring that ditch down to help fill, but that wasn't built. And then again in 1887, following the best harvest they ever had, Casgrain considered building a 1 mile long ditch up to the Evergreen Nursery, where there's a lake up there. I don't know if you've gone along TT and you see that little S curve there. Well, there's a lake there that could be tapped into. That's about 5 feet above the level of the marsh and could have brought down a very efficient flow of water. But the cost of doing that was $2,000. And I think Casgrain was concerned that it might be more sunk cost, more good money after bad. And we didn't think that necessarily building that would help make the marsh movable. Long and short of it is he didn't do it. Peter lived alone and had only one relative in the United States, a first cousin in Chicago. And in June of 1892, he took a much-needed 1-week vacation to visit them. Upon his return to Door County, he said, "The city is too large for him, and the water in the river altogether too dirty for comfort." A sentiment still shared by many today. The Cranberry enterprise as a whole was not profitable. Casgrain had invested no less than $25,000 into the cranberry operations over the full time. Although it was capable of producing 500 barrels a year, it had good capacity. In a good year, when there was a harvest, it was more typical to generate only 40 to 50 barrels. 40 to 50 barrels would bring in $500,000 at best. Clearly not enough to cover the investment. Had they been able to approach the 500 barrels a year on a consistent basis, that would have brought in $5,000 to $10,000 a year and made it a very profitable enterprise. But it was not to be. Cranberry Pete, as he was known throughout the township, tended the fen for 25 years of continuous cultivation. The last good harvest year was 1897, when it was reported that Peter Johnson gathered about 30 bushels of fruit, which was the best in a long time. Casgrain. The farm is set pretty high for William Casgrain. He came from a wealthy family. He was the youngest of 8 siblings, and 2 of his brothers served in the Canadian Parliament. Following his 3-year term as Milwaukee Public Works Commissioner, he started a contracting business in 1882 to bid on and construct harbors. This was his forte. This is what he did best, building things that were related to harbors and other public works projects. And he had no problem garnering a large volume of work, at one point employing up to 75 workers. He kept ties with his colleagues and friends in Sturgeon Bay. He was always the gentleman. They called him Sir Richard, even though his name was William. And they called him Captain Casgrain, even though he had long resigned his commission. He had a hand in constructing the new Door County Courthouse back in 1878 and supported the effort to bring the railroad to Sturgeon Bay in 1893. His teenage son, George, would often come up in September and help Peter with the harvest. In November 1889, tragedy struck the family when a 20-year-old daughter, Marion, died of tuberculosis. The following year, he had a financial setback when Casgrain declared bankruptcy, dissolved the company, and moved to Chicago to work for another contractor. From that point on in his life, he resumed that itinerant life, often living apart from his family. He suffered another financial setback in 1895 when he was contracted to build a levee on the Mississippi River north of St. Louis. He bid on the project, built the levee. It was very close to completion, and then a flood destroyed it. Now, he honored his commitment. He was building it for the U.S. government. He honored his commitment, and he rebuilt the levee with his own funds. And when he received payment, it was at the original amount that he bid, causing him great financial loss. The following year, he became severely ill with inflammatory rheumatism, and he put all of his fen property up for sale. This was the ad that ran in the Advocate. The top ad, which identified Casgrain, indicating he's selling all his land, that ran for 3 weeks. The ad below, which just describes the property, and I believe also included Peter's 40 acres, ran for 3 years. And he did finally sell the property in September of 1899. The gentleman who bought, the person who bought it was Frank Ingram, and he bought these 3 lots, lots 2, 3, and 4, and then all of the, basically the fen property here. He paid $755, and it was only $113 down on a land contract. Far less than the $5,000 he'd been offered 18 years before. Peter soon followed suit. In a couple months later, he sold his property for $150. The person who took over the cranberry marsh, had no interest in cultivating cranberries, and he let the cranberries just go fallow. He used the cleared land for grazing sheep and used the outbuildings here for his barn and possibly his home. But for all intents and purposes, the Cranberry Marsh was done as an entity. Concurrent with the sale of his marsh property, William Casgrain had recovered well enough to resume his engineering work. In early 1900, he completed a lucrative assignment on a $1 million courthouse in Fort Wayne, Indiana, reflective of his role in Sturgeon Bay 18 years earlier. But his financial difficulties resumed, soon losing his courthouse commission on speculations in Fort Wayne and on the Chicago Board of Trade. Previously, he lost $35,000 to a fraudulent Chicago banker, which had forced him into another bankruptcy. William returned to Chicago in 1900 with hopes of reestablishing his engineering career, letting an office in the Monodock building downtown. Although his wife and son's family lived in a house in nearby Evanston, Casgrain chose to live in the city and was said to be an infrequent visitor at the family home. In need of funds, while in between work assignments, Casgrain attempted to borrow money on his remaining real estate interests, but was turned down. He became deeply despondent and conveyed this to his personal attorney, who expressed his concern and tried to dissuade William from doing anything rash, that his prospects could improve. But his itinerant life, ill health, and financial setbacks finally took their toll. On September 28, 1900, William Thaddeus Casgrain took his own life in a Chicago hotel room. Though estranged, his family was devastated. When word of his death reached his friends and colleagues back in Door County, they were greatly saddened. At first, Peter did not believe it. The Advocate reports, Peter Johnson refused to believe the report that his old employer and friend, Captain Casgrain, had committed suicide. He said the story was a story that the newspapers had got up, that his old employer was too sensible of a man to do such a thing as to take his own life. Now, Peter did not return to his native Norway as he said he would after he sold his land. He had become inflicted with a chronic disease which caused the decay of his upper jawbone, and he endured much pain without complaint. He went to Chicago for an operation in the summer of 1901 and was reported to be near death in a hospital there. He sufficiently recovered, though, to return home to his beloved Door County in late August, but as winter approached, he took a turn for the worse and died that January in the care of a close friend. His obituary reads, Peter Johnson, one of the old-time settlers, passed away this last Saturday morning at the home of his friend Jens Olson, who lives on the bay shore near the canal. He was about 70 years old, unmarried, and had lived here since the early 70s. For a great many years, he resided on the Casgrain Cranberry Marsh property, looking after the interests of the owner. He was well known to every resident of eastern Sturgeon Bay town and highly respected by all. This concludes the hidden stories of Peter Johnson, William Casgrain, and for that matter, the Cranberry Marsh. But what about the road? What about this old path through the woods? Did it serve as simply a way in and out of the Cranberry Marsh? Did it serve as a logging road, or logging was a big industry back in the late 1800s? Or are we not looking at a big enough picture? Would it have been a segment of a larger road that extended from the southern part of the township all the way up to the northern part? Quite possibly, all three were true. When Casgrain purchased this land in 1873, he entered agreement with the seller, William Scott, that Scott could log the property for 1 year, which was common in those days. And to do that, he would need to have a road to move his product out of the property. Likewise, when Peter sold his property in 1899, the buyer intended to completely clear cut the property and to convert it into a farm. And clearly he needed a road to assist in getting the timber out of the property. Also, there were reports in the 1890s that when around the fen there was logging, that those logs were moved down the canal road to the canal and banked on the canal awaiting transport. This indicates that there had to be a way to convey the logs to the canal, and the lost road would be a candidate for doing that. This is an aerial photograph of our area. You can see that it's basically the same area that I've schematically drawn here. This was taken in 1938. It's obviously an aerial photograph. What it shows is in the area of the fen, nothing says human intervention in nature like a straight line. And in this part of the fen, there are straight lines. And what this indicates to me is that there was human cultivation at this time, which provides, I think, visual proof that this was the area that the fen was cultivated. Down here, we can see Buffalo Ridge Trail. You can see Lake Forest Park Road along here. And coming off Buffalo Ridge Trail is a small road. You can just see it. The resolution of this aerial photograph is good enough that you can actually see a road coming off here. And that is the precise location of where the lost road would have been based on the 1927 survey map. And you can follow along here at the edge of the clear cut. This was Peter's land that he sold, and it was fully clear cut, you can tell. But you follow the road up here, and you can see another place where it's visible down here. And if you recall, we talked about using geographical markers to help identify where the road would be. This is Chippewa. If you take that line due north of Chippewa, you get to an area here where the road does in fact turn north, which tells me that this is the same road that was on the 1927 Lake Forest Park survey. Up here, we can see the road clearly again through the woods. And if it's visible from this height, it has to still be a road at that time. It's heading more in the easterly direction. And this last circle up here is my estimate of where the road ended as drawn on the 1927 survey, just short of the southern ditch to the fen. Now, I did see this road on the map, and for quite a while, I was thinking that this visible road through, and this went through Peter's property as well, and wound its way all the way up to the southwestern edge of the fen. I thought for quite a while that that might actually be the road to the Cranberry Marsh. And there are three reasons why it's not. The first is that Casgrain had let these properties go. He sold this one in '82. He sold this one he lost the taxes in 1992. That couldn't happen if Cranberry operations were on that side. Also, Ron Amos, who is the current owner of the Evergreen Nursery, is quite familiar with the fen and has studied it for his own interest. And he assured me that the depth of the water on this side of the fen is too deep for cranberry farming, that over here it's much more conducive depth to grow cranberries. And then lastly, my neighbor Jim Janning told me that when he owned this property, he had talked to the previous owner, and that the structure that was up here had been built in the 30s or 40s and was, that he was letting out and later burned. So the structure up here was not related to the Cranberry operation. Peter's shanty was here, and he did walk this road during the cranberry season daily to look after the vines up here. Now, this map also shows the reason why the lost road disappeared. And that's because when Lake Forest Park was built in 1927, it made this road redundant as a path, even if it did go up further to traverse in this direction. Likewise, there was no more cultivation at the marsh. There was no more trees to be cut here. You can see it's pretty well clear cut, so its role as a logging road was irrelevant. And also, there were just roads put in here that could reach Lake Forest Park. So the road fell to the wayside, and over time, it basically just was erased from the landscape. Now, we're back to the 1899 township map. The reason I'm using this map again is I want to illustrate some events that occurred in the 1870s that provides sound evidence that there was a road that traversed the entire township, and that the lost road was a segment in that road. Back in the 1870s, before the canal was completed, there was a series of piers, wooden piers that were constructed along the lakeshore. The first being Horns Pier back in 1871. Scott's Pier, this is the same Scott that sold Casgrain this lock here. Scott's Pier appeared on the tax rolls in 1874, which tells me in 1873 it was probably there. And that William Scott, when he harvested the timber from the lot he sold to Casgrain, moved it over to his pier here. This pier up here is Lily Bay, and it was constructed in 1878. Back then it was called Sherman's Bay or St. Joseph. Now, each of these piers was critically important to the local commercial economy of these areas because they were harvesting timber and they had to move it, either use the timber locally or move it. And there were no roads to move it on in the 1870s. There was no railroad in Door County. It had to be moved by water. And that could only be done if there was a pier in the vicinity. And so these piers, though they were wood and were subject to the elements, they got battered by waves, they got crushed by the ice in the winter and had to be repaired. It was worth repairing them because they were so valuable to the local economy. Once the canal was completed and we had a harbor of refuge in here, there was no need to, eventually these piers all faded out of use. And eventually, as nature has taken its course, and they are now hard to find. Horn, who owned this pier, had a store in conjunction with it. He lost everything in the 1871 Peshtigo fire, but was able to rebuild and reestablish his business. In 1872, the telegraph came to Sturgeon Bay, and it came from two rivers, came through Horns Pier, and came around the head of the bay and into Sturgeon Bay. Now, what I'm getting to is, when Horn's business expanded, he wanted to duplicate what he had up here. And in the end of 1877, he wanted to build both a store and a pier, he and his partner Joseph. And reported in 1877 was as follows. From W.H. Horn, we learned that operations on the new pier and store in Sherman's Bay is being pushed forward as rapidly as circumstances will permit. A gang of 20 men are engaged in building and hauling. Lumber is hauled to from Horns Pier by teams via the canal road. The telegraph will also be extended to the new pier, the poles for the wire already being set. What that says is that to build the store up here, they were moving the lumber from down here, and they were moving it along the canal road. You know, this was the canal road. And they were doing it in December of 1877. And there was only one way they could get through at that time, because in the summer of 1877, construction resumed on the canal. And it was dug up to here, and it was dug from the bay up to about here. This shows it better. This is a canal completion map of January 1878, showing this road that was used for hauling all that lumber right through the canal area, going up past Casgrain, Cranberry, Marsh, coming from Horns Pier and Clay Banks. Now, in addition, the Horn and Joseph wanted to connect their two stores by a telegraph line. And the expositor in December of 1877 reported the first telegraph line running to and from Horn and Joseph's new pier at Sherman's Bay, up here, will be a branch from the Clay Banks office down here. The branch wire from Clay Banks will run alongside the main line, that main line that goes into Sturgeon Bay. It will run alongside the main line until near Casgrain's Cranberry Marsh, when a turn will be made and the wire will run along the lake shore to Sherman's Bay. What that says is there's a telegraph line going, which likely followed the road. And when it got to this area here, the vicinity of Casgrain's Marsh, whereas the main line went into town, the line to St. Joseph went here and went along the lake shore all the way up to here. Now, this indicates to me quite possibly it followed the same road that they were hauling the lumber on, and that there actually was a continuous road that got to St. Joseph. Now, I want to fast forward 50 years. 1926. You remember Oscar Stegeman was negotiating to buy property for Lake Forest Park. He was negotiating with the Congregational Church in town because the individual who bought Casgrain's land for $755 eventually gave the land to the church and then agreed to live on the land until he died. But the owner of Casgrain's Marsh and all that land there was now the Congregational Church. And in negotiating with a representative of the Congregational Church, Molten Raw, Stegeman had this following property description of what he was buying. And it reads, the Congregational Church property, including the entire shorefront of lots 1, 2, 3, and 4 of section 12, and running back from the shorefront to and including a sandy ridge on which a road runs in a southwesterly direction just east of the swampland. Here is lots 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is the shorefront. He's talking about buying the land from the shorefront back to a high ridge on which there is a road that runs in a southwesterly direction. On the one side of it, to the west, is swampland, and on the other side, on the lake side, is the land he wants to buy. But he describes this road running on this ridge in a southwesterly direction in lots 1, 2, 3, and 4, and voila, it's consistent with the path of the lost road. Now, it's just a theory, but I believe quite strongly, and I will look further, that I believe that if you follow this ridge through Lake Forest Park, you will find a reasonable pathway. That was the road that originally ran all the way from Horns Pier up to Lily Bay, and quite frankly, may have run all the way from Two Rivers up to Bailey's Harbor. But that's a hypothesis. Now, my neighbor, Paul Lutsky, is the owner of what was Casgrain's Lot 2. And if you recall, the property description was from the lakeshore back to a ridge upon which the road ran. And this is the ridge that goes through Paul's property. And as you can see, what looks very much like the road is on top of it. Now, granted, Paul has maintained this road for his own purposes, so it's not like a wild road in the woods, but it is consistent with that property description that was on Casgrain's affidavit. Now, let's fast forward to today, or at least to 1981. I consider anything during my lifetime from a historical perspective as today. This is a geodesic survey map from 1981 that shows elevations and what the land, types of land are. And obviously you can see the fen here. You can see all this marshland up here, which was consistent with that property description of a road coming right up on a ridge next to the marshland. But what is unique here, what's new here on this map, is it shows a trail. This dashed line here is a trail up from Lake Forest Park Road through the woods till it reaches this area in here and then follows this northeasterly tack. And what I discovered was that this dashed line, where I've outlined it in blue, precisely matches the path of the lost road on the 1927 survey. Again, you can go down here to the Chippewa access and draw that straight line up, and it matches where the road makes that turn to the north. Now, this area over here, no trail. And that's why I had so much trouble trying to locate the road originally when I was looking for it in the woods. What this tells us is that the lost road was still visible in 1981. And to affirm that, my neighbor, Carol Schuster here, recollects that when she and her husband Pete would take walks in the woods, they would come across what she described as a logging road. In fact, it was a road that sometimes in the winter we would cross-country ski on. And so clearly there was a visible road, and she and Pete have lived there since 1980. And more recently, Carol and Pete would lead hikes through the woods from their home here, which is right at the Chippewa access. They would lead hikes through the woods to the fen, and invariably they would have to cross the lost road. I was fortunate to participate on one of these hikes. This is me with my hiking buddy, Rio. And I would recommend on hikes like this to carry one of these sturdy hiking staffs to help you keep your balance when you're crossing creek beds that are in between these sand ridges in the woods. And likewise, once you get out to the fen itself, this is Carol. She has her staff here. It's good to keep your balance. Now, I would never recommend you doing this by yourself. The fen is a dangerous place. I say this in all seriousness. The reason I was comfortable going out here is Pete and Carol knew what they were doing, and they knew where the fen was here relatively shallow, just 3 or 4 feet. But each of these people, they are walking on a bed of vegetation that is floating on the water. And that's why you see all these interesting plants here, these picture plants that grow only in that kind of environment. But anyway, be cautious if you do go out to the fen and do it with someone who knows what they're doing. Just for a moment here, I'd like to say a word about Peter Schuster, who passed away in 2021. Pete was an avid local historian. and he inspired me to get involved in studying local history. Most of the exhibits you see in my presentation, and particularly the maps, are all from Pete. He loved history. I think the only thing he loved more was his family and his simple love and awe of nature. I miss him dearly. Roth Road, knowing that it was there, I couldn't resist taking one more walk in the woods to see if I could find it. So last week, I went out and went to about this section of the woods here and looked for what appeared to be a road and started following it. And I got to this point, and what you're looking at is the path I was following literally cuts through a dune. And this is the first indication of human intervention for a road that I found. This is a path that goes through a dune and speaks to me that it's a road. And I followed this road through the woods. It became narrowed down to just a small footpath, and then got up to the higher elevation on the dune, and it opened up again and looked again very much like a road. Then this is looking eastward, then it turned to the north, and again narrowed down. And this is as we're approaching that southern ditch that emptied out the fen. And I knew I was getting close because I was using my GPS. And just beyond here, I descended down, crossed what appeared to be the ditch, and I got to this point here. And this is the boundary to section 12. This is effectively looking into what was Casgrain's land and the area where the Cranberry operation would be. The fen was over here to the left, and this is where I think the outbuildings would have been, and likely where the road came through.
You're quite the detective, I must say.
Yeah. I'm sorry, was there a question?
No, I said you're quite the detective.
Oh, okay. Almost done. This is a recent aerial photograph of the fen. You can still see the telltale straight lines of the Cranberry farming operation here. Of course, you see the two ditches which are still visible. This ditch, which I did cross when I was on that hike, is basically a series of puddles. It really doesn't flow anymore. Whereas this ditch on the north is deeper and has a full flow all the way to the lake. Also, what's different here is that the trees have filled in where there had been a complete clear cut back in 1938. All this land that you see in this photograph was at one time Casgrain's, except for this little section down here in section 13, line across here. And in that last photograph, when I was looking at his property, I was standing about here. And this is the point where Peter would have entered the property as he walked through the woods every season for 25 years, from his shanty to the fen to tend the vines. Although time has erased this road and the Cranberry operation from the landscape, its story and the people who surround it are not erased from our memory. And for the fen itself, the one constant in our story, this ecological jewel that has withstood all efforts to be drained and cultivated, is now thankfully preserved in its natural state to be appreciated and enjoyed for generations to come.
See inside the part, like flower.
Thank you. Before we take any questions, just bear with me for a second. I would like to thank several folks that helped in putting together this presentation. Laura, of course, for her research on Casgrain and the Cranberry Marsh and finding many excellent old newspaper references, and for teaching me how to use Google Doc. Steve Rice, who I believe is here today, he's with the Door County Historical Museum, for gathering together and allowing me to review the 1870s county tax records. Those are beautiful books if you ever get a chance to look at them. For Carol Schuster for her personal reflections on the Penn area. Her husband Pete for his pristine maps of 1800s Door County. I just wish I could find where he found them. For Kagan Haringa from Crossroads for sharing her knowledge of the Penn. For Ron Amos of the Evergreen Nursery for his technical expertise on the Penn and the Evergreen Nursery. For my neighbor Paul Lutsky for providing the 1927 survey map. It's the only original copy that I'm aware of. And for his tour of his property, Lot 2, Section 12. For Dennis Garrity for permission to walk his property. For Jim Janning for his knowledge of dwellings near the Penn. And for my wife, Annette Vincent, for suggesting and preparing the timeline and for indulging my many walks through the woods when there was plenty of work to do at home.